Okay, so I would like to welcome you both here in our room and those listening to us on the webinar. We have been careful only to spread the URL and the streaming opportunity yesterday because we didn't want to have people not show up, instead taking advantage of the easier opportunity. It's a select audience. This is certainly owed to the fact that the school year is just starting. So it's very difficult to attract at the moment colleagues and faculty to this, and there's an enormous number of events taking place here at our School of Public Health. Actually, within this building only, there's 1,400 events per year, yeah, similar to this one. Yeah. It's not? I thought it. Okay, it's on, and I hope I don't have to repeat. Still, welcome in case I was not audible before. This one, however, is of these 1,400 events of this year, certainly a special one. I think it is an extreme honor that the leadership of a European agency is giving us the opportunity to have this event, to talk about European and US approaches largely around food safety, anything about food. I think this is evidence for the fact that the European Food Safety Authority and specifically our center, the Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing, are enjoying for many years now a very productive collaboration. You will hear during the various talks some of these elements. Very specifically, we are both interested very much in evidence-based approaches, and we are pursuing this. And I think I will not take more time at this moment, but like to introduce as our star speaker of the day, the Executive Director of EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, Bernhard. He got in this position in 2014. I know this very well because I was among the 7 interviewed for this position. And I'm very happy that he got the job, because I could never have achieved what he has done in this time. I think EFSA is on a stellar course since then. So Bernhard, this is your podium. Give us some of your ideas, and let's discuss them in the context of other presentations later.
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas, and thanks to all of you giving us here a sort of a podium for Europeans coming to the US and discussing with you about food safety, some aspects. Of course, I cannot cover, and I will not cover food safety as such, but a very specific part about our science. We are in the business of risk assessment as the European Food Safety Authority. I think I have to give, or should give, a few contextualizing information for you, because the system we have in Europe is quite different to the ones you have here in the United States. In Europe, we have risk management and risk assessment in the food area very strictly separated, different to the US FDA or to US EPA, which means that what we do as EFSA, European Food Safety Authority, is purely based on evidence. So we give scientific advice. We don't take risk management decisions. It's not about labeling, it's not about testing, it's not about sampling, inspections, audits. We take evidence that others have produced, sort of a meta-science, and we integrate, we assess, appraise different streams of evidence and integrate it into something that we could call a hazard characterization, and then combined with exposure data we come to something like a risk statement. And we do this for different aspects of the food chain. We start with plant health, animal welfare, but then also chemical contaminants, microorganisms, virus, parasites. So this is more our generic risk assessment part, where it's much about public health, salmonella, listeria, dioxins and all that stuff. And then we have another department which deals with what we call regulated products. These are products where someone wants to have a market authorization, and a pre-market risk or safety assessment is needed. And that's, for example, the case for GMOs, for pesticides, for feed additives, for food additives, for food contact materials and stuff like that. And all that we do with staff members of about 500. We are located in northern Italy, in Parma, separated from the risk managers in Brussels. And our main, I think I can say the main brain force is not within EFSA, it's not the 500 people, although most of them are scientists. We work with experts that we, in a way, mobilize and get as a sort of an endowment from the member states. So we work with volunteers, experts that we find via open calls that volunteer to contribute to the European Food Safety Project in a frequency of between 20 to 50 days per year. And with this model, I think Europe in the year 2002 has decided something quite smart, because this model is very flexible, which means if we look, for example, we have a question about the use of insects in food and feed, then we look for the 10 people that have most experience from their research and regulatory side within Europe. We bring these people together, they work with us for 1 year, 2 years, but they stay employed in their member state organization. So it's a very flexible, we are always, so to speak, at the edge of research. We don't have these people employed, different to FDA or EPA, which has upsides and downsides. The upside is it's very flexible, the downside is it's a fragile system, because we rely on the contribution of our member state institutions. And if they would tell us that we member states cannot afford any longer to lend our best brains to EFSA, then we have a big problem. So in a way we have outsourced our core process to volunteers that we don't pay, that we don't control and have no contract with. As a private company you would think twice whether you would do that, to outsource your core process to volunteers. Anyway, this approach has worked very well over the last 15 years or 17 years. EFSA produces about 500 scientific opinions every year in a steady state production mode, and obviously we discuss a lot about quality of this science, what defines the quality of what we do, and how can we make our science trusted. And that's one of the biggest challenges we have in the regulated science area, because we can produce the best science we think, the best evidence-based outcomes. If there's no public trust into this science, it's more or less useless, because risk managers will not use this science to take risk decisions. And we had difficult examples in Europe in the recent past when we were talking about herbicides, one specific herbicide, glyphosate, where we learned that if public trust is deteriorating, then it's very difficult for the risk managers to stay on an evidence-based basis, because they come under big pressure from a value-based environment who tells the risk managers, don't look at the evidence, we don't want that stuff. And this is why we think and we are convinced that science in the regulated area needs trust. That may be different in the academic area, where you have a hypothesis-driven science. You build a hypothesis, you test it, and either it survives or it has to be discarded. But you know, whether this is trusted or not, you could say we couldn't care less, we publish it, and then we have scrutiny and peer review, and if it doesn't survive, the hypothesis has to die and we move on. But in our regulated area, if the outcome is not trusted, the whole society has a problem. So we are investing a lot of thoughts. What makes science trusted? Can we ask for trust of the society? Or do we have to behave trustworthy? That's the only thing we can do, to behave trustworthy. And what defines whether a public institution that does science is trusted or not? And how can we be part of this process where evidence meets values? This is the area where the clashes come. When we come with our evidence and this meets values, political values, societal values, which are in contradiction to the evidence. And glyphosate is a good example. We came out and said it's not carcinogenic, and up to 0.5 milligrams per kilograms it's safe. And the people said, yeah, might be, but we don't want it. Our value tells us we should not use herbicides in the European agriculture. And here, when science meets values in this hot area, we invest a lot of thinking, also money and people, how we can engage with civil society, and this comes to the talk now on engagement, how we can engage with the civil society so that trust is possible. And interestingly, over the last 2 days, we met the colleagues from US FDA a full day yesterday, the colleagues from USDA, Agriculture Department today, and their most pressing topic was communication and trust. It was not immediately cumulative exposure or in vitro toxicology. The most pressing topic was how can we communicate in the future and how can we make sure that trust is possible. So with this short prologue, actually a bit a long prologue, I'm sorry for that, I'm going to that, what can we do in our scientific business to increase quality and understanding of our science via engagement. So I will talk a bit about scientific value and quality, engagement and transparency. Is transparency a sort of a guarantee for trust? Question mark. About impartiality and methodological scrutiny. I also look at the watch and you tell me, Thomas, when I should stop because I'm a bit unpredictable, unfortunately, in this respect. Now with this picture, I would like to expose to you our concept of scientific quality. What you see here at the top is we start with the society. The society has demands, fears, expectations. And we would say in this political sphere, in the society expectation, what society asks from us is to be transparent, to be participative, and to be objective in our science. And with this context, risk managers, politicians are framing questions. They are framing risk assessment questions, which are then thrown into the scientific factory. And this is done by risk managers, by politicians, by administrators. It's not a scientific task. How can you integrate the demands of society into the question? Because the way you define the question obviously is very important. It predefines also which breadth and depth of answer you will get. So the risk managers, our customers, translate this demand of the society either in legislative documents, guidance documents, regulations, or they ask us specific mandates, individual questions that we respond to. And what we clarify together with them is, of course, the terms of reference, what is it about, a deadline, and then, more important for us here, the degree of scientific value. And we define the value, the degree of scientific value is constituted by 4 factors: impartiality, methodological rigor, transparency, and engagement. We say these 4 factors define the value of our scientific work. And this is not quality. And we have so many problems also in EFSA to differentiate between quality and excellence. We always talk about excellent science because we all want to be excellent. But quality does not mean excellence. No, quality means you deliver what you promise. And not more and not less. Quality does not mean it's a 5-star hotel. Also a 2-star hotel can deliver 100% quality. You get what you expect and you get what you pay. But the value is different between a 2-star and a 5-star hotel, obviously. But both can deliver 100% quality. And we try now for many years also to discuss with our scientists that it's not about excellence, it's about a predefined scientific value that we have to deliver to our risk managers, which is defined by these 4 factors. And the extent to which we deliver, to which we can implement these 4 factors, this defines the value of our work. So then we do our risk assessment work, we deliver risk assessment, and here quality comes in, because we say quality means we deliver what we promised, what we agreed upon at the beginning. This is quality, not more, nothing to do with excellence. So what do we deliver in quality? We answer the terms of reference, clear, we should answer the question. We deliver on time, if possible, and we deliver according to the clarified degree of scientific value. And this seems to be intellectually quite a simple concept. No, there's nothing complex, but it's very difficult for our scientists because they say, no, we have always to be excellent. And I say, no, we don't have to be excellent always. Sometimes we are quick and dirty. depends on the need of the risk managers and depends on what we have agreed in terms of value. And now if you look into this a bit closer into this quality, we would use this curve to say on the x-axis you have the amount of effort that we invest into delivering a scientific advice, and on the y-axis you would have the scientific value. And obviously we assume that with increased effort you can deliver more scientific value. Obviously if you invest more in engagement, transparency, rigor, impartiality, you can deliver more value. And excellence would be somewhere, you know, at the top where this S-shaped curve meets in the infinite. This would be excellence. So we are of the opinion that we predefine a scientific value together with the risk managers, and then we apply certain criteria to deliver quality. Now let's look into that a bit closer, into our risk assessment work. You see here how we work on the right side of the slide, meaning we have a mandate. This is the question we get from the risk managers. Then we do a problem formulation. What does that mean? What the risk managers want? We do a protocol development, which is very important that we upfront develop a protocol how we will do our work. It's completely normal in the laboratory. You develop a protocol of what you want to do. It's not so normal or a given in scientific risk assessment. Then we do the assessment, we collect data, we embrace the evidence, we validate data, we integrate evidence into so to speak, one body of evidence. We apply weight of evidence approaches, to what extent we trust the evidence. We use expert elicitation processes to get implicit knowledge of experts into our process, especially when we have data poor subjects. Then we adopt opinions, we report and we communicate. That's in a simplified way our risk assessment process. And I'm talking today a bit about engagement with society in this risk assessment process, and Marta afterwards will talk about engagement with the scientific community, more from the research part, how we can get innovation also by influencing research. That's also something very important for us. How can we influence the European research programs, that it's not only about smart cities and 5G telecommunication, so that also money is invested into safety-related research, which is even more important for thinking about the future, 2030, even more 2050, 10 billion people on the planet. We need about 60% more plant calories, but we should not use more land because we don't have more land, and we should reduce greenhouse gas emission from agriculture by about 70% to meet the Paris climate targets. So in this triangle, 60% more calories, don't use more land, the opposite, restore biodiversity, and reduce greenhouse gas emission by 70% to keep to below 2 degrees global warming. It's an extreme challenge for the society. It's one of the biggest challenges. How can we do that? It needs a complete transformation of our food systems. It needs a complete transformation of agriculture, of our diets. It's not possible to continue with eating beef in the way we do. I heard a figure from the United States that the United States beef consumption contributes 3% to the calories intake of the population in the US, but it contributes 50% of agricultural greenhouse gases. 50%. So beef is basically gone. I mean, it's a bit strong statement here in the United States. No, you should not do that, and I have never said this officially. So I will focus a bit more on this engagement, and now we say, when the society's expectation have been framed into a risk question, and we start our work, which you see in the center of the slide, and you have two triangles. On the left side, so to speak, the general public. On the right side are more the science, the academic scientists and our peers. Then you see that the level of engagement from the public increases during the process, whereas the level of the scientist decreases because the level of freedom for influencing science decreases when we come to the end of our risk assessment process. Now when we talk about engagement and transparency, can transparency or can engagement, maybe it's better the other way around, can transparency support and lead to engagement? And what are we doing here as EFSA on this front? You see again our process, we know this already, it's a standard risk assessment process, and over the last 5 years we have implemented a lot of initiatives to increase transparency. We publish everything in our EFSA journal. We have brought our EFSA journal on a modern publishing page. We work with Wiley here. We publish protocols. We share the protocols up front. We have set up what we call a knowledge junction, an electronic platform where you can upload and download elements. They all get a digital object identifier. They are citable. We have created a data warehouse. We have an R4U model platform. We do open plenary meetings where people can come and interact with our scientists. We have guidance documents. We do understanding science videos to use tools of transparency to engage with the civil society. Because what we have learned, and I think also what the US have learned in the GM debate over the years, is that the old theory of communication, that there is a deficit, it's called the deficit model of communication, which means we know, the people don't know, but if we could get enough knowledge over the table so that they also know, then they would trust us. But it's not true. It has proven to be wrong, wrong, wrong. So the deficit model of communication we can forget. Although communication still is important, but it's not enough. And we say transparency in the sense of being open, which means we would open the curtain so that people see what we do in here, is an important step, but it's not enough for trust. We have to go a step further, which we call engagement, which basically, I think you would say is a no-brainer. Yes, of course, we have to engage with civil society, but what does it mean? How do we engage with 500 million people? What mechanisms, what tools can we use that we bring science back to the society, that people say, okay, maybe I don't like your outcome, dear EFSA, because it's against my values, but I trust your process and your people. This is what we want to achieve. And you see here in our data warehouse we have different tools, portals, EU open data portals. We work with OECD on that. We have an API portal now where machines can talk to machines and download data. So we try to upgrade also on this side. We have these R4U models that you can run in your browser, so you don't need specific software for that. And you see this is about benchmark dose modeling, for example, but also about screening of abstracts. So we try also to make these tools available for the scientific community and ask the community also to upload their tools. So to build something like a platform that can be used by risk assessors. Yeah, this comes up here. This is one thing where we invest quite some money also, machine learning and the use of AI, mainly for plowing through evidence. Because the problem we all have, I think you as well have it, that the evidence is growing exponentially and we don't have enough brains to assess the evidence. So could we use machine learning and algorithms to pre-assess the evidence, to do screening of scientific literature before we come with the human brain? And we only recently have learned that Springer, the publishing house, has published in April the first book that was completely written by machines, no human intervention. It's a book about lithium batteries, and apparently the algorithms use 10 million publications to condense and assess into the form of the book. Apparently it's not a good reading, but if we think about that, that's a bit like Gutenberg, no? It's a revolution, a book that is completely written by machines. And we think that we can use machine learning and AI also for assessing evidence, maybe even for a quick and dirty risk assessment in a way that you don't need any human intervention. I mean, that would be fantastic, no? Because if we could do risk assessment without human intervention, we could allow the people to ask what if questions. The people could do online scenarios. What if we would put in a limit, an MRL? What would that mean for the exposure and for the risk? On impartiality, yes, I think that goes without saying. We do public consultations on the process, on data. We do public consultation on the protocols. I'll show you a few examples. We did a lot of work in setting up protocols up front and discuss with the scientific community, for example, on dietary sugars, on sodium, on bisphenol A, on complementary feeding. Now we are having public consultations for sweeteners, for aspartame, but not only aspartame, also for other artificial sweeteners, to get all the input from the scientific community, whether we have the right protocol, to make sure that we don't overlook something. And then when it's about methodological scrutiny, we do consultation of guidance document, we use crowdsourcing, we use expert elicitation processes to, again, I would show here this, I skip over this where we did innovation contests for crowdsourcing. The one that is going on now, a challenge where we use Innocentive as innovation platform, is about automated named entity recognition, which is very important when we talk about language, that we know what we mean if we use a term. And there a challenge is out until, I think, December 2019. And with this I would like to close with wrapping up, trying to connect on the one hand scientific quality, to deliver good science, robust science, to make this science so transparent that others could redo it. It's a basic scientific principle, no scrutiny, peer review, redo and maybe even come to different conclusions. So how can we make our science reusable? And then we have produced over the years 5,000 scientific opinions. Could we create something like a meta-knowledge if we look at these 5,000 opinions from a different angle? Because there's knowledge that is not in a single opinion, it's not the brick, it's the house. And finally, last but not least, how can we, together, I would say, with the academic community, get science back into the society so that we don't have these vaccination debates that are horrible, or that we don't have this myth and fake also about food and agrochemicals. And there we need a strong link to academic communities, and this is the reason why I'm so happy to be here today in one of the most prestigious schools in the world, I would say. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bernhard. We will have later time for discussion of all, but if there's any technical question or so, I would certainly allow this at this point. Everything clear? You have seen a visionary drive into a big agency. I think this is really 21st century what we have seen here. And I'm very happy that you were presenting this in a very short frame. I think we can continue directly with our second EFSA speaker. Marta Hugas is the scientific chief scientist of EFSA. With one of her predecessors, Hermann Kutter, I was working very closely in organizing the World Conference in Rome 2009 for alternative methods, so this brought me a couple of times to Parma already in the 2000s. You will address, from what I understand now, some aspects which are more on the scientific side, after we heard now about the engagement side, and I'm trying to help you to set up your talk. Let's see. Here you are. Excellent. Let's get started. She has an education from Spain, working there as an assistant professor in Barcelona, later on at one of the leading food safety institutes, a lot of microbiological background. I will not go into any level of detail, but I give you your time, your 20 minutes to talk. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today to address what we are now doing in EFSA, frame also with being framed already now by Bernhard, how we try to engage with the scientific community and how we believe that actually influencing research agenda so that our needs in risk assessment are also captured there. as you may know, the European Commission is now moving towards a sustainable Europe, and they had a reflection paper where also the SDGs adopted by many member states at the UN are also central, and they are also central in what is now being put into place, the new framework research program in the EU called Horizon Europe. The SDGs are very important elements in the Horizon Europe so that to reach them, and we should already be moving because 2030 is just next, it's around the corner. So, by doing that, there's also some reflections on how we could also reduce waste, how we could improve nutrition, so to reduce obesity, because also the European population is now having overweight. More than 50% of the population is overweight. And there's also some elements that show us that actually growing with less carbon print is also possible. So there's some hope and some there that we could be moving towards sustainability. And sustainability will also be one of the key words in the next European Commission because it's the only way we could move ahead. In our work on doing risk assessment, we often encounter knowledge gaps that prevent us to do what we believe would be the best way to develop our risk assessment. For example, how to do in a fast and good way exposure to multiple chemicals, how to assess the synergic effect of pesticides and pollinators, how to input the climate change elements into our risk assessment, how to be prepared for the future. Something you know very well, how to replace animal testing with predictive models. Still we are not yet there. Despite many years of research, we keep doing our toxicological, our safety assessment very similarly to the way we were doing them many years ago. How to impact the human data and big data and artificial intelligence in our risk assessment. What does it mean, the number of micro and nanoplastics we see in the environment? What is the impact on human health? We don't know yet. How also we can prevent vector-borne diseases and the big impact they have on our food systems. So all these are knowledge gaps that we face. But when we look at the research programs and Horizon 2020, that's the current research program in the EU, we see that they don't really address these knowledge these knowledge gaps that we have. So we have been reflecting that now in the new framework program there's also big opportunity to leverage the needs that we have, because in a way, if we are not ready to do the new assessments that come to our plate in a good way, in a fast way, we will be blocking innovation. And so far, risk assessment research needs have not been captured because most of the goals of the research programs are growth and innovation. And risk assessment was seen as, okay, it's something that is there, but it's not that needed for growth and innovation. This comes later on. But if we are not ready and prepared to assess with the new methodologies, the new challenge that will come ahead, then we are not ready with a good timing to assess the pre-market authorization that come to our plate. So in this context, and also another element is the human microbiome. And now we are seeing the big developments and the big findings on the human microbiome, and we wonder, will the human microbiome, the gut microbiome, be a new organ in our risk assessment that we need to take into account? How to do this? How to do this in a good way, and how to get ready, how to build capacity internally to be ready, so when there is more knowledge on the microbiome to input that in our risk assessments. And not only is the void and the knowledge gaps that we see, but also the way we approach them. And we are used to assess elements in a vertical compartment. That's human health, that's animal health, that's environmental health. And this is also a paradigm shift that we need to integrate, that is not it's not different health, it's just one health. And the paradigm for this one health approach is antimicrobial resistance, and we have seen us antimicrobial resistance, the only way to tackle it is taking the approach of One Health and the impact that animals, human and environment have all together and the interrelation among them. So this is also the a new way we have to see and to forget about the silo approach and adopt a systems approach that we all talk about, but we don't really know exactly what it will mean and how to get prepared for that. Well, all the three elements are strongly interconnected in this One Health approach. And in all these reflections in the EU, the EFSA is not alone. In the EU, we have more than 35 agencies, decentralized agencies, and 17 of them deal also with providing scientific advice to policymakers. Among them, the Medicines Agency, the Chemical Agency, the European Centre for Disease Control, the European Environmental Agency. So those are the closest agencies to us, or the ones we call sister agencies, because we also see that we need to work also more closer to them. And all the agencies in the EU that deliver scientific advice to policymakers, we are also forming a network that's called the UANSA network. And these UANSA network agencies, we also realized together that we need to join forces to leverage and to influence the upcoming research programs. So we published this paper on the research knowledge cycle that identifies 5 different areas where these agencies we could influence so that the research programs also tackle our knowledge gaps, our needs. And this paper has also been useful in our dialogue with the UODG research in this new Horizon Europe program to raise awareness that this policy, this advice to policymakers is also very important, and devoting resources to this area will benefit the whole of the EU. And in EFSA, under the leadership of Bernhard, this is an area we've also been putting efforts lately. And last year we had what we call the Risk Assessment Research Assembly, where we brought together research funders, academics, and also risk assessors. So to discuss how we could better serve the system and how we could join forces. And it came that most of the risk assessors in member states and the academic community ask EFSA to be a knowledge broker, to have this function of bringing together research and risk assessment together with the scientific community. So our objective in this research coordination, because we don't do research, we don't have laboratories, but we are the beneficiaries of the research that is going on. But very often this research doesn't really meet our needs. And despite a lot of investment and a lot of euros, millions of euros being invested in an area that's needed, at the end of the day, when there is a consortium formed, when there is a proposal signed, they go maybe in a different stream, and at the end we don't benefit as we could from the work done and from the investments. So we believe that we could also become this knowledge broker for a wider risk assessment community and advocate the uptake of regulatory research needs, so to build synergies with research projects and avoid duplication and make sure that this money is best invested and comes back to the risk assessment area. And to have also early access to deliverables, to outcomes from research projects, and also at the end to foster impactful research that feeds the regulatory science and the policy and decision maker. So in our website, under the engagement tab, you will see now a research platform where we publish them funding programs, upcoming calls. There's also an area for partner searching, also an area for ongoing research, for project ideas, and also the programs that we believe, the calls that will be published soon, and the programs that could be interesting to our academic community that works on risk assessment. We also have them have published the calls that will upcome. And so far we believe we've been a bit successful. Still we don't know where this will end up, but also beginning of this year we had a workshop with DG Research in Brussels that they call a multi-stakeholder workshop, trying to address the robust science and innovation environment for food safety systems of the future. And during this workshop we discussed the food safety systems of the future and the possible needs for action. We explored options and opportunities for the possible creation of a European research infrastructure platform, and the chair of our scientific committee introduced breakout sessions on what are the food safety challenges that we need to give priority. And this fits in the broader discussion of the Food 2030 and also in this Horizon Europe, the new framework program that will start beyond 2020. We also, in our past history, we also been collecting what are the research needs that we see in EFSA from risk assessment. But in the past, this was more a kind of a shopping list. So different areas, different panels and the different units in EFSA were saying, well, we need this, we need that. This time, we also articulated what would be the research needs in the future, but in a different way. We articulated this in the 3 research streams, and we have now published a paper you can find in our journal of the EFSA research needs for the future. But this time we use a different approach. We use more kind of the language that DG Research is using, and also identifying the impact that if these research needs would be tackled, how our world would be different in the time that the outcome of the research would be delivered. And the first of the research stream is what we call safe food systems. So the idea is to improve the safety while moving towards alternative and sustainable production systems, anticipate impacts on food safety of innovation in food production and food systems from the whole food chain at processing levels and also at primary production. So this also integrates animal and plant health. And also we believe that it's not enough assessing the risk, but it's also needed to assess the impact of the risk assessment and the alternative and the cost benefit that a given risk assessment could also be given. And the example of that is the glyphosate story. We have been doing the glyphosate assessment, but there's been no cost benefit impact assessment and socio-economical impact assessment identifying what if pesticides are not used, what if glyphosate is banned from the agriculture area. So we believe that with this food research stream, we would be prepared for big social changes related to climate change, migration, and changing consumer choices. And under this title, there are 5 sub-streams that are published in the paper that I also invite you to read, because some of them are with a second stream, some of them are a bit overlapping, but it's interesting also to see what will be the impact if this research is done. The second research stream is the innovation and risk assessment. So anticipating impact of innovations and new technologies on integrated risk assessment. The current approach that we see is maybe too research intensive, mostly animal-based, and raise issues in terms of reproducibility and ethics in animal testing. And still we don't have a know-how to avoid completely animal testing. And this currently risk assessment paradigm is challenged by recent technical advances and public demand. So we need to move ahead. And again, in this research team is also to have integrated the different healths in the One Health approach. And finally, the third research stream is understanding the context and delivering and communicating impactful science. So to understand the context, the research will focus on understanding citizens' concerns, perception, expectations, and integrate risks and benefits, while at the same time promoting education and mobility of experts to acquire transdisciplinary expertise, because that's also the future, is where innovation can grow, when it's in the overlapping of different disciplines. And this holistic risk assessment will also integrate the use of big data, of artificial intelligence, and by doing this research and innovation also, of course, building capacity for the risk assessors of the future, the new generation. So thank you very much, and I will be happy to answer.
So, this was short and crisp. Any technical questions for this presentation? Okay, this seems not to be the case. So we can move into our coffee break, which we owe actually to FDA. Because we had foreseen a presentation by, let's say, the US counterpart, the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, for the last 4 months, and we learned yesterday evening that the speaker could not make it. Our desperate efforts to have somebody replace today did not work out, so I apologize to those who came for hearing this. We announced this in our previous advertisements for the event. But those not on the net, but here in the room, enjoy now some coffee and tea. I think we can, in about 15 minutes, come back and continue then with the contributions from Hopkins, so that you learn a bit where there might be some cross-fertilization, some resonance with activities here in our school. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just fine. You have something up here?
Bloem.
It says.
Because I don't know, how does it work? Like, I can use...
I'll use these.
Okay.
You need to point?
Because I never... No, I don't need a pointer. Good. Just...
Okay, can you take the seats, please? Would like to continue, and I hope those on the web refilled their coffee or whatever cups you're using. Yes. So it is my pleasure to start the second round of presentations, which is now coming from Hopkins, and we will start off with Martin Bloem. Martin is a dear colleague in our department and directing the sister center to the Center of Alternative Animal Testing, the Center for Livable Future. He will present what the center actually is about. I think he will also give you a bit of his personal background as type of introduction, then hand over to one of the rising stars in his team who is interested in food safety issues. Martin, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Well, of course, it's always nice to be at a meeting, particularly when we have important guests from Europe coming over. You know, being from Holland, it's nice to have our fellow Europeans here. So that's why I was interested when Thomas asked me, okay, are you interested to join, you know, and organize this together? I said, yes, of course, because it's important. And we also have a, you know, joint donor, which also is helpful. But anyway, if I, you know, would like to discuss a bit before I start to explain what CLM is all about. It's a bit my background. So I worked about 20 years in Asia after I finished my medical and PhD degree, and worked a lot on nutrition. Was already linked to a certain extent with some of the work at Hopkins, particularly the work of Al Sommer. Focused a lot on vitamin A deficiency control, but that was also the first contact with me with agriculture, and mainly funded by the US government. Very interesting if you're European. So you learn, in fact, how this is, you know, the whole issue of donorship. Then after that, I joined World Food Program in Rome for about almost 13 years, and was a director of nutrition as well as of HIV/AIDS. And dealt with UNAIDS, with all the, you know, all the different other 11 UN agencies and working on policies, but also in nutrition. I was very involved, of course, the policymakers in principle in the field of nutrition. So you learn a lot about, in fact, what it's all about, you know, if you have to create policies, how you have to work together. And I think, you know, at that time we were part of the, you know, to develop the Sustainable Development Goals, as you know, Bernhard will understand. So we had a couple of 3 years when we started to think, you know, many different meetings were organized in Rome, but also in Madrid, to say, okay, what is the goal of number 2? We are mainly focusing on number 2, but of course, because of the HIV/AIDS, I was also involved in 3 to a certain extent, but to a much lesser extent. But you could see what is actually so important, what is the difference between the previous Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, is that for the first time the UN developed goals which were not anymore important for low or middle income countries, they were important for all of us, which is a fundamental difference than, you know, the previous way of thinking. And I still think it's very difficult for Europe as well as for the US to think that in fact the goals are for all of us. It's still a big battle, but I think it's something more and more, I would say. That's why I'm very pleased when I saw Marta doing the presentation and saying, you know, for us actually the development goals are critical. So yes, it's really important. But we all know that these development goals are wicked problems. Now, we cannot hardly define them, but the most important thing is that they're interdependent. So you cannot anymore work in one particular field. You work in food safety, you need to realize what is food systems, what is public health. All these different things are interrelated. So it's a whole different way of thinking. So CLF is actually working mainly, I would say, at 3 different levels. We work on food systems, we work on public health, of course, because we are, at least in the US, the best public health school of the US. But also we work on climate, and nutrition, of course, is interrelated with all these different things. And so let me go back. One of the arguments I want to make is that if you work, and I've learned that in HIV/AIDS, is that we work with 11 other UN agencies, and all these 11 UN agencies, like UNDP, UNFPA, UNICEF, World Food Programme, they all had a different language because they have different goals, different donors. It was so. What the strength of UNAIDS was to come up with the same language. That's one step which is really important, to understand that you can communicate with each other. But the other element is, of course, when you talk about agriculture, or you talk about health, the amount of money which is involved in one particular field is very, very different. And a good example is that when I finished my PhD after my medical degree, I had a very short time because I was offered a job, started to work in international field with Hartung International, but I needed a job, so they transferred me to TNO, which is a kind of same CDC of Holland, and I was working on, foodborne infections. And so we found the first, case of salmonella in Holland, and I was very excited because, okay, that's some work. But immediately we got the message from the Minister of Agriculture in Holland that we couldn't actually present the data, because we had so much export. It was so incredibly important for the government and for the state that we were not. And I was thinking, what's going on? A week later or so, or 2 weeks later, the same salmonella outbreak was in the UK. So, and then of course we were allowed to come up with the findings. But just before I did this presentation, I was going back to the web, and I say, okay, because this was a story, I was telling it quite often, but so can I find something? And I found this article actually just now, like a couple of hours ago, which is really interesting. So the Minister of Health in the UK, when she brought this to the table, she was almost fired because of the farmers and because of Minister of Agriculture. So you can see that if you work in this field of food safety, and it's really important that actually public health is not as important. We don't have a lot of money. So we have to make our case in a very different way, and understanding the politics. And of course, when you work in Rome for 13 years, you understand the politics of agriculture. But it's so, sometimes we had joint meetings, of course, with WHO, but the agenda is very different. So I think it's important to realize that money is still one of the main drivers behind policies or actions. So, okay, it's true, we are a university, the Center for Livable Future will focus on research, education and practice, of course. That's typical, you know, what actually the mandate is of Hopkins. But practice is actually very serious, and that's why we are a center, and we exist for the past 25 years. We were very lucky to have a private donor supporting the center in this field, which is quite unique if you understand the context of US, universities. If you always have to look for funding, but the center always had enough funding to do the work we did. And that's where we can be independent. We are not dependent sometimes on government funding to do some of the work we are doing. So we work at least 5 different levels. We work on occupational community hazards of the food system. We work on environmental contamination, climate change, impact of the food system. We work on, of course, food safety of the food system, unhealthy dietary pattern, and food insecurity. Those are, in principle, the fields we are working on. One of the elements was, in fact, CLF and antimicrobial resistance research. It was not that we always do the work ourselves. In fact, we give funding to some of our partners in the past within the department and sometimes other parts of the school to do the research. We work at the Food Policy Council network. This is both in Canada and the US. It's quite extensive. So this is the translation again of the research we do. What you were just mentioning, Bernhard, so the communication with actually people at the community level, or at least at the I would say city level sometimes. We do interestingly polling. It's very, of course, US in a sense, but it has a lot of implications. When you start to do polling just before election, you can actually influence politicians. Not that we are doing it, but at least the facts are there, that we see that we can actually measure what in fact a population wants. And sometimes there's much more a lot of things in the US, of course, is very partisan, but in fact, people actually have opinions which are much more bipartisan, which is very interesting. So this kind of interesting data will help us sometimes to move things forward. The other thing is food waste and strategies and food safety, a very important component of our research. Ronnie Neff is one of the professors which work a lot on it. But what's interesting for me, for example, is the first 3 elements, what we call prevention in the whole food waste arena, is that in fact standardized data labeling is very critical. And of course you deal with food safety at that particular moment, no? So how can we label that we can actually use food in a much more longer way, in a more efficient way? At the same time we have to have safe foods, You can't just do this. And some of the companies are very worried about it, that if they give it to an NGO, for example, who use it for the food bank, and you get some cases of infections and automatically their name. So how do you deal with that? And I think thinking about food waste, you just mentioned it, Marta, that this is something we really need to do at global level. How do we deal with these kind of things? No? The other thing is that, of course, living in Baltimore, and Baltimore is, when I arrived here after 13 years in Rome, it's a very different city as Rome. I must admit that. But in my work in the international arena, I worked, I think 60 cities or 60 countries or so. And one of my favorite countries where I did a lot of work was also South Africa, particularly Cape Town. So when I arrived here, I felt, wow, this I don't want to be offensive against Baltimore, but it's very similar to my feeling about what happens in Cape Town. A lot of segmentation, different life expectancy when you go to different neighborhoods, it's classical when you arrive in Cape Town that when you go to the coast, life expectancy increases almost with 25 years. And it's similar a bit, I don't know the data, but I know in Washington it's about the same, but most probably in Baltimore we found the same things. Very interesting. So we work very closely with the city of Baltimore and with the mayor to actually find certain areas which are, for example, the food desert. We don't call them food deserts anymore, but there's a lot of things. And I think Keeve, Professor Nachman will actually just go more into some of these results. We'll talk. The Safe Urban Harvest, this is a Keeve will present the results. The other element, as we all know, more and more is interest in fish for many different reasons. From a nutrition perspective, and my background is also in nutrition, is of course it's definitely important. Even looking into cardiovascular diseases, but even in Alzheimer, there seems to be some indications that it's even useful for that type of prevention of those kind of diseases. But there is a big trend that in fact there's more and more aquaculture to compensate for in fact the lack of fish through fisheries. What a lot of people don't know is in fact that most of the fish, even when it's caught, but definitely when it's produced, is actually come from Asia. And that's both for the US as well as for Europe. I think Europe actually takes about 35% of the total aquaculture production to Europe. But it's interesting to see that can actually influence negatively some of the poverty reduction programs for example, in Indonesia. So many of the poor people actually consume very small fish, the tiny fish, in those countries. And it's really good from a nutrition perspective because there's calcium, because they don't eat just the meat, they eat the total fish. But those small fish is now used for actual agriculture. So they cannot afford the big fish anymore. So that's exported to Europe. And at the same time, they will miss, in fact, the calcium, and there's not enough milk actually to compensate for that. So you can see that everything is interdependent, and we need to realize that that's the way the world is working. On the other hand, for example, a lot of the shrimps production, they use antibiotics. And because of the rules, as you did, of course, influence positively the change in that behavior because Europe was importing shrimps from Asia. You can see, so there are good things, bad things, but at least we have to understand that everything is interdependent. One other part which is interesting is another colleague of us, a part of the team, is Dave Love, and we have a team within who focus on all the issues related to aquaculture and fisheries. But he does very interesting work on the oyster supply chain. And he worked very much with the industry to actually find out, okay, what are the bottlenecks if you look into this. But interestingly, of course, he took the oysters as the target because the oyster is such an expensive product. So in fact, the industry was very much interested in working with us because, of course, the safety is extremely important. And when you pay a couple of dollars for an oyster, you want to be sure that in fact it's safe. But if it would be a very cheap fish, of course, the situation would be different. You can see, but maybe it was, that's why I think it's very creative using oysters as the entry point for looking at all these issues in the supply chain. Well, one of the last type, well, we do a lot of work, and it's a pity that I didn't know that you were interested in climate and food security as well as looking at sustainable diets. But Professor Nachman, he's the first, he's the senior author of, how do you call it, the principal investigator. And the paper will come out on the 17th of September. And what is very interesting of our finding, we looked into the 9 different diets, the climate impact of 9 different diets in 140 countries, so it's a global paper. One of the most interesting findings is that if low and middle income countries wants to have a healthy diet according to WHO and FAO, if you take the norm of the dietary recommendation, they all need to increase their greenhouse gases footprint because they all produce it at a lower level. It's of course very different for US and Europe or for Latin America. So it's very interesting that our finding is showing that we can actually do it, but we need to understand that we have 17 development goals. And one of the goals is also economic development, where nutrition plays an important role. And if we only focus on climate, then actually we will never actually change the world, because for many poor countries, economic development is number 1. But if you can do it in the context of the right information and climate, you can actually make a big difference. It's very different to explain this. We just hired a communication firm, and just to explain to them, and even within the school, that this complexity of the data we will present, it's not straight for the paper, no? But we are normally used to have straightforward answer, and actually, but in fact, the more research we're going to do is complex. Well, the last part of what type of work we do is the real cost of food. And so the Prince Charles is very much interested. We met with him a couple of months ago. I must say, first time I ever met royalty from the UK. But it was very interesting because it was so interesting to see that in fact people are interested in the real cost of food. And if we understand the real cost of food, some of the things we are dealing with, public health and the consequences of the way food is produced can actually be paid for. But as long as we think, no, that's not, it's just, then in fact, I think we will have a hard time to convince actually agriculture. So I think it's a very important, research. But we also know this is so complex that we cannot do it, at this level. We need to do many different projects to actually fill in those gaps of the real cost of food. So the last slide is that, okay, for me, another issue, you mentioned that complementary food is one of the goals, looking into it. I worked a lot on trying to find local production of complementary food, also working with companies like DSM, for example. But it's very, very important to look into it, because many countries I worked in, like Tanzania, Kenya, a lot of local people produce complementary food absolutely without food safety. But the women are working and they have no other choice than buying this type of food. So how do you deal with it? Because some of the NGO communities say, but it's good it's local. Because they think that local is more important than food safety, and they say the industry will push food safety because, and the discussion is much more complex than this. And I think it's important that we go around the table and discuss those issues. Well, food labeling already mentioned, insects you mentioned. Insects, of course, will play an important role. We know that about 2 billion people in the world are actually using insects in their diet. But we have to think about food safety. We have to think about cultural aspects, how to translate this, what is the form. But for me, it's a fascinating part of the future. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm glad you gave this historical perspective from scribbling down on the back of the napkin to EBTC now. So I will continue with go back to that big picture perspective of the innovation and the challenges of bridging the science and innovation and bringing the value to society. So we're focusing on very methodological, evidence-based project. So, but just to frame the question a little bit. So there's a cognitive bias, right? And so I found this quote from 1956 actually, which is related to what everybody is usually saying: if you're a hammer, you treat everything as a nail. So we're all trained in certain techniques and scientific disciplines and whatnot. So we always tend to first, of course, apply the things that we know. So what are the other challenge of bringing innovation into, especially in the regulatory environment and risk assessment, is lack of confidence. The regulators really need to be confident that the new tools, whatever they are for risk assessment, that they actually are going to produce results that are valid, right? Because you can't really, it's not inspiring confidence if you have to retract your decision. You've certainly seen some of those things. The resistance to change, of course, and that's normal. That's human nature. You don't want to change. You've always done this safety assessments, and you tend to rely on them. So, and and of course, there's a lot of cases where even in the clinical medicine, right? So there are procedures and medical practices that tend to stick. And even though there is evidence-based practice guidelines on using the newer, more effective tools, the physicians on the ground tend to still use the same tools. And that was from a year ago from article in New York Times. So there really there is a need for a rigorous reproducible framework that would put the confidence of the new tools. Right? So I'll give you a little bit of a historical perspective starting from the napkin that Thomas mentioned on where things were in the international efforts in bringing the systematic review and evidence-based approaches in risk assessment. And that was, I guess, the napkin, or it was before the napkin, the first international Congress on evidence-based toxicology in Como that Thomas has initiated in 2002. And then I want to mention that one of the first agency, I believe, that started pioneered the use of systematic review was EFSA, and there was significant first publication there. And there are other agencies. So this work really was driven by agencies, and I believe it's because of the desire to make the scientific assessments, put them on a more solid ground for regulatory use. So there's NIHS, there's EPA work, and a number of these workshops. So in yellow there are workshops, and in green are the publications, the key publications. This is not a comprehensive list, but this is the timeline that I believe has some relevance for the discussion. And then in 2016 there was the new Toxic Substances Control Lab, and I know you have a meeting with EPA tomorrow, so that you will learn about this. And there the systematic review actually was specifically mentioned as something that's mandated by the government. They have to use systematic methods in risk assessments now. So, and in 2017 we did a joint colloquium with EFSA in Lisbon, where we have the report that was written and whatnot, and we have a lot of interactions and interact now with EFSA in many projects before and since that time. So there is a number of workshops also that just happened in a quick succession in the last few months. The National Academies of Sciences had a workshop on mechanistic information, how to integrate it in the risk assessment. There were 2 workshops, one in December and one now in June. I was on the committee at the National Academy of Sciences for this. And EFSA was invited to both and was able to come to one of the workshops, which we were very pleased that they could. And I have to say that actually, especially the second workshop on evidence integration, it really came out from the EFSA workshop in Lisbon. So it really looked carefully at the report, and that was really the beginning of the workshop was starting from that. So it was really important work. I want to also mention that we're starting working tackling the AOP, adverse outcome pathways, also in collaboration with EFSA, and conducting the workshop in Parma, continuation of the Hamilton that just happened in June, on AOP frameworks for development of new IATAs, integrated testing assessment strategies. Right. So there are many challenges, of course, in applying systematic reviews and evidence-based practices to toxicology. On every step, so here you see the steps of the systematic review, and you see that at every step in toxicology you have multiple challenges. They are on the left side here, and then on the other side you see some of the workshops and publications that we've done, and some of them in collaboration with EFSA, that are trying to tackle some of those things. And of course, once you start doing systematic reviews in toxicology, you immediately realize that on every step and every corner, you see that there are methodological challenges, and these challenges need to be solved by multiple organizations working together. And that's actually at the core of what we're doing. So in one of the biggest challenges, especially in systematic review, is the literature quality, lack of structured abstract. So you see that the clinical literature standard is where you have, in the abstract already, you have the conclusions, you have the patient population, the drug, the results and conclusions. So the busy physician can just look at the abstracts. They don't necessarily have to read the paper unless they want to. So in the basic science and toxicology included here, you see something like this. So we've done thousands of papers that we screened at EBTC, and of course sometimes even the model is not mentioned in the abstract. And you don't actually know whether it was in vivo study or in vitro study or human study. So you have to go to full text. So that of course makes it much more laborious to do. So, and we're tackling some of this with some of the work that we're doing. So the recent workshop in Hamilton, so there's a program that I'm showing here. So it was done with involvement of OECD and their test guideline program. Patients Brown and Bruno, who are very interested in using the AOP as one of the pioneers of AOP framework at the OECD in building more confidence behind the AOPs and systematic existing AOPs, and also how to develop the sort of from the ground systematic AOPs, potentially on systematic maps and such things. So these discussions have started and are going to continue in Parma. So just briefly about EBTC. So we are an organization that's funded by CAAT, by Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing, and we really are trying to bring all the stakeholders to the table to talk about evidence-based methods and systematic reviews and develop those methods for safety evaluations as in consensus on discussions around the same table. So our vision is that evidence-based methods are the standard that all regulatory agencies around the world will use in the future. So we are funded by CAAT. We originally started as a project of Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing, and now are diversifying that funding with some of the additional small contributions. So I want to mention that we are also using volunteers and in-kind contributions in much smaller way than EFSA, but a lot of our work is done by the volunteer reviewers and by our partners who contribute the various resources, including the scientific experts in screening the literature, putting together the protocol, writing the publications, and such things. And some of them are mentioned here. So we have our own board of trustees and scientific advisory council at EBTC. This is who we have on our board of trustees, which is very important for us to keep very close communication with all those folks. We're very thankful for their contributions and their time. We meet twice a year, and Didier Verlou from EFSA is participating in, and is very active usually on the board. We try to maintain the diversity, so we have the non-government organizations, industry representatives, and regulators. So this is the partial Scientific Advisory Council of EBTC. We have now, I believe, a few more members, but we also try to strive for the same balance on the SAC and also the variety of scientific expertise. Our products are really falling into two categories. One is actually performing systematic reviews, and we started with the CAAT objectives and CAAT's mission on test methods comparison. So we're doing a couple of projects in that space, comparing the in vitro mechanistic tests to animal-based tests and to human outcomes. So there's two of those that are currently running. And the second one is, as already mentioned, is methodological approaches, and trying to adapt and develop new methodologies for using the systematic reviews. So these are our current working groups, and again the highlighting is blue are methodologies and the yellow are actual systematic reviews that we are conducting. We also have formed a few new working groups. One is the Toxicology Journal Editors working group. We just had a meeting at the end of May where as a result of this we're working on a consensus statement for practices of systematic reviews in toxicology that we're hoping is going to come out in the next couple of months. And as a result of these meetings that I mentioned before, we are starting this AOP working group that's going to continue the work in Parma, and also the work on doing systematic maps and AI-based based tools. So these are very new for us. Yeah, and in vitro critical appraisal standards, that's going on as well. And importantly, I want to mention that we're working on all of those with very tight cooperation with the regulatory agencies. So this is who does the work. So we have, there's a few very small staff, so it's myself and full-time, and then I have 4 folks who are doing the work part-time and working on managing multiple projects. And we heavily rely on our Scientific Advisory Council and the board on strategic advice and the working group members. We also have volunteers. One of them is here. Unfortunately, he's leaving back to Turkey. But without the volunteers, I don't know where we would be with all these projects. So it's very important for us. And as I mentioned, there are in-kind contributions from a variety of different partners who we're very thankful to. Thank you.
So, any questions for Katya? Not the case. Thank you very much. Obviously, everything was very clear. So let me see. It's difficult. So I have the privilege now to close our series of presentations. Okay, here we go. My work over the last almost 20 years was very much around chemical safety and cosmetics. First with Equam. But food safety was always very close to this. And actually it was in 2008 when I was shortlisted only a second as food safety director in Sanko that I decided to take the offer here and come to Hopkins and accept the chair for evidence-based toxicology, what you were just presenting. But beside this chair, I have the privilege to head CAAT. CAAT is just this month celebrating his 38th birthday. So it's really the oldest center in the School of Public Health. It was created by Alan Goldberg. For 26 years he did lead this, and I have taken over since. And I always like this t-shirt tag to say what we are about. This t-shirt tag reads, "These t-shirts were tested on animals, they didn't fit." This is what CAAT wants to do. We want to work on those things which do not fit, where the animal experiment does not do a proper work. But we are also doing refinement of animal experiments. We are not advocating against this tool. If there's nothing better, we have to use it. Because the primary interest in the School of Public Health, for me personally as a physician, is patient and consumer safety. And we can do so because we mainly live from philanthropic support, which is more than 50% of our budget. Relatively small in comparison is the support by about 30 companies and foundations. But this is a very important part because they are the sounding board. They tell us we do something meaningful. And it's also very important that on our board we have agencies here on the US side, EPA, FDA, various NIH groups, and academics, so that we really have a balanced representation. We are very happy that on the European side we have a European branch since 2010. At the University of Constance in Germany, that EFSA is represented as a board member on this side. And we get money as everybody else because we're doing competitive research from money from FDA, the European Commission, Department of Defense or the NIH. And there's always space. If somebody has a rich uncle or your company is not represented, feel free to approach me. I will skip this largely. I have some conflicts of interest, but I think they are all well published. And in interest of time, I don't have to talk about this. The collaboration with EFSA was really a very, very positive one over the last 5 or 6 years now. With board representation, joint workshops, I don't have to repeat what Katya was doing. We're looking forward to be in Parma beginning of October. Our work is not driven only by the aspect of animal welfare. We are interested in the science, we want to advance the science, we want to do better, but we also want to have a view on aspects like economy. This was an article from last year, the most important omics is economics, which I think is really an important view to have. And it's quite fascinating that you find that in vitro toxicology is now valued at 14.4 billion as a business, while in vivo toxicology is only 4.2 billion. So this is contrary to the perception of most people that we are fighting an uphill battle to replace animal testing. In vitro is happening. It is not necessarily taken for the regulatory decision making, but a lot of product development is done, and the things don't even arrive at the regulatory agencies because they have been characterized before. We did ourselves a study published last year where we asked the question, how good are these animal experiments actually? And this was quite fascinating. We used the 6 most frequently used toxicological tests. The 6-pack of toxicology. They consume about 57% of the animals in toxicology in Europe. Only there we have statistics, which means it's quite a chunk, 600,000 animals every year. 200 million euro, 220, 230 million dollar are used for these. And we found that they were on average only 81% reproducible. Because we used a large database from ECHA where we found multiple tests for many chemicals. So this was done for each and every of these animal tests on 350 to 750 substances which were tested more than twice. And interestingly, this is all inflated by the fact that a lot of chemicals are simply not toxic in these assays. And the non-toxic substance is non-toxic is non-toxic. Those which were toxic showed only 69% reproducibility. And this should show us that the window should be, or let's say the door should be much more wide open for replacing traditional methods with new approaches, because I think no regulator can sleep well with a tool which is only 69% reproducible for finding toxic substances. I will come back to this study in a moment. And we have no indication that for the more complex endpoints where we have not such analysis, anything is better. This is a wonderful study by Wang and Gray, which showed for 37 substances which went to the National Toxicology Program that all of the non-cancer endpoints were not reproducible, not between sexes, not between mice and rats, and not to historic data on these substances. Very worrisome study. And you can do the same for carcinogenicity. 127 substances have been tested a second time, and only 57% reproducibility was achieved at $1 million per study. So you have to imagine this. And for reproductive toxicity, it's not different. Mice, rats, hamsters, guinea pigs, they all reproduce each other by about 60%. So this is the objective facts of our toolbox, which I think should give us some guidance. I've been more recently interested in the food safety also on the US side, and here we have a very interesting historic concept of GRAS, of generally recognized as safe. And this is an article I would like to refer you to, what I learned over time being involved in this, published also last year, which says in essence it's a pretty rigorous system if it would be applied. And if the data would actually be public, which they are not, more than 80% of the information on food additives is not in the public domain, so we don't have this information. And it's quite interesting that the US lives with 4,500 food additives, while we have only 10% of this in Europe. And while there is no public assessment and no public assessment by regulators, EFSA is already now in the second round of assessing food additives to be completed in the next 3 years or so. So there's a completely different safety standard in what is being applied. And so far there's little room for alternatives. The very prescriptive FDA rules are referring to the Red Book of 1993 as the main source of information. Evidence-based approaches have not been really exploited, and altogether it's a very different standard. And this was the reason why we thought it would be interesting to hear from both sides what are current developments in food safety. And I think even without having heard the FDA side, you can say Europe has become the pacemaker of regulatory progress, of introducing new methodologies, and I was very happy to hear this from you. I will quickly say a word about exposure sciences, which so far has not been in the focus of our own work, but exposure science is developing at the moment also. Sometimes it is really the bottleneck, it's the exposure side and not the hazard side of risk assessment. But there's interesting concepts at the moment developing. The human exposome is one, the totality of exposure of humans and measuring them by the impact this has on phenotype, what is really changing in humans. And another very pragmatic approach, the concept of thresholds of toxicological concern, which says in the end, don't sweat the small stuff, forget about the low level concentrations of things, let's focus on the things which have relevant exposures. So we are very much vested into metabolomics. Andre Kleinzang here in the group is leading these efforts with us because this is an omics technology using mass spectra mostly, which is closest to the phenotype, so what really is changing in humans. And we have been doing quite a bit of work, reviews, several workshops, 2 information days, one in Europe, one here in the US. And we have mostly also been focusing on what can this do in toxicology and how can we improve the quality of metabolomics. Because very different to the genomics studies and transcriptomics studies, which have been, with a lot of emphasis by FDA, have been brought to a standard which nowadays allows to use them also for some regulatory purposes. Metabolomics has not undergone this. This was a workshop we did in 2014, published in 2015, which now led to a workshop in 2017 with, involving the FDA, NIST, NIH, and NCI and other organizations. And we published already, as a consequence of this, how we want to improve quality assurance and quality control in untargeted metabolomic studies, and I think this is a very important effort, which is now spanning also the European side. And I believe very much that there is an opportunity of combining the concept of adverse outcome pathways, so the mechanistic part of toxicology, which Katya was referring to several times, and the exposome. Because mechanism can make sense of all the stuff we are measuring in our omics technologies. I like to call this the toxome because I had the privilege to head a program which was called Mapping the Human Toxome by Systems Toxicology, an NIH-sponsored program of 6 years, where you can see very prominent organizations were collaborating, including the EPA as an associate partner. And we were trying to explore how cell culture models can be analyzed with omics technologies, orthogonal, different combinations of omics technologies, and making with software tools sense of these things. Because each and every omics technology has too much noise, we cannot measure enough, but if you see a change in the same pathways on protein level, on metabolite level, and on gene level, you can actually say this is a meaningful change which is taking place here. And this has resulted in 27 publications and some tools. Agilent is already including in their technologies, was one of our partners, so the scientific community has access to these. Just to give you an example, one of the most recent publications is actually publication number 28 in this context, was one where we applied some of these tools to bisphenol A, and we found very interesting results which clearly indicate that bisphenol A is impacting on biological systems not via engaging the estrogen receptor, but by something which is downstream confluencing, which is really challenging a couple of the concepts of the about 4,500 publications which exist on bisphenol A. This concept is now influencing also the exposome community in Europe, and then you can skip this. And I think what is interesting perhaps for you here, we are in the process of creating at the moment an exposome center. We got some start funding from the department. Ram Gurmutri and myself and Alex Mertens from my team and Fena Sille are the co-directors now of this new exposome center, which we will officially open on the 8th of November when Steve Rappaport is giving a talk here, one of the exposome guys. A topic we have been interested in more recent time is big data. And from my point of view, this is really the new kid on the block, not counting the number of dead animals, or as I used to say, the number of legs hinting to the sky divided by 4 is the outcome of a toxicological study. It is really about using comprehensive data from various information sources. And some of you might know that in 2016 we had quite a bit of publicity when we downloaded the data of the ECHA registration process in Europe, and developed a database by natural language processing which allowed us to really mine 800,000 toxicological studies on 10,000 chemicals which were at the time available. An enormously rich database, which for example allows us now to use these big data for the thresholds of toxicological concerns which I mentioned, which are simply saying if you have enough chemicals studied, it's extremely unlikely that the next chemical will be much more toxic than anything you have seen before. So it is using this distribution of no effect levels and simply saying, let's say we take the 5% percentile of this distribution, we add a safety factor of 100, and then we are able to define where there is no concern anymore because it's so unlikely that something is more toxic. And this really gets a lot of substances out of the discussion. I don't have the time. This is another article from 2017 here where I described the concept and the history of this concept and how this interacts with other approaches, so I invite you to read this. Our journal Altex, by the way, in the meantime, an impact factor of 6.2 is open access and is available for anybody. So let's talk for a moment about the hazard part and what our activities are on this side. And I want to come back to Tom's work because we went a step further. The database now allows us to make a predictive tool. In the meantime, we have an enlarged database which includes 10 million structures, 300,000 with biological, about 60,000 with animal data. And this large database, in a collaboration with underwriters' laboratories, a safety standard organization like the German TÜV or TNO, which developed as first implementation reach across and now the UL cheminformatics toolbox. And we developed an approach which is called RASA, a read across based structure activity relationship, which combines two approaches. Read across is a very pragmatic way of interpolating data by simply saying what do we know about similar chemicals around. Typically done manually by an expert saying I know the environment and for this reason I can conclude with some certainty about what is happening. A QSAR is typically a computer-based model where you use chemical descriptors in order to make a prediction, finding a world formula for the chemical universe ideally. And the RASA is now just mining the similarity space. So it's only using similarity, no chemical descriptors in this sense. But there's a comprehensive use of data and allows us to actually do this in a comprehensive way by a computer, and for this reason you can also express how certain are you and you can validate this approach. So this looks somehow like this. We forced the computer to calculate a network, a map, where these 10 million structures are placed on the map, and when they are close and similar, then they are close to each other, and if they are very different in structure, they are far away. This took Amazon Cloud Server with 180 cores, 2 days of calculation. So this was about $5,000 of calculation costs to produce such a map. But now with only 500 million calculations, which is seconds for a computer, we can place any chemical into this map. So also chemicals which are not among these 10 million. And we can then simply ask, what are the neighbors and what do we know about them? So this is a picture how this really looks like. I have to enlarge it to really get you into it. And you can see here, at this point you can really see individual chemicals, and the distances are shown by these strings. And then you can start adding properties you know, sensitizer, non-sensitizer, whatever, name it. And this is about 50 trillion comparisons which are necessary to establish such a map. And then we introduced another concept which is data fusion. While a QSAR is typically done on, I want to know something about eye irritation, so I ask, what do I know about eye irritation on other chemicals? We simply said, the subs, we might know nothing about the neighbors on eye irritation, but we know something about skin irritation. And something which is skin irritant will also be an eye irritant. And you can make similar comparisons. And this gave us, in the end, the opportunity to validate a system for 9 health effects, the most commonly used tests in toxicology. For 100% of these substances we made predictions, and you see the number of substances here, 10,000, 15,000, 17,000, 32,000, for which we had animal data. And overall, we were able to do 190,000 predictions like this with 87% correct results. And this compares to the 81%, 69% reproducibility of the animal tests, which we showed for a smaller data set. This gave us a lot of attention when we published this last year. Nature and Science covered it the same day, and a lot of lay press. About 150 articles were published in the next 3 months. Because this was a moment like when Garry Kasparov, the world champion in chess, was beaten by a computer for the first time, because obviously the computer performed better than a human being in this. The article, according to Gary Miller, the editor, has been downloaded 24,000 times until March last year, which is 6 times more than the highest ranking article so far for the journal. And Stefan Platz from AstraZeneca very nicely commented on this and said, artificial intelligence will not replace toxicologists, but those who don't use artificial intelligence will be replaced by those who do. And I think this is really, it is just the beginning, it's the first implementation, and I think the scientific community has to go on here. We are in the process of finalizing an agreement with the FDA to explore this for food additives and cosmetics. I'm not sure whether the signature has been done or not. I was hoping to hear from them today, but there is a concrete plan giving them free access to this. And we're also negotiating at the moment with a foundation who is willing to spend close to $2 million to further the research, but also to make it public, to make it open access, to get it out of UL's paywall, so that anybody can use this type of approach. And we hope first discussions that the OECD would host such an approach, that we can make it available like the QSR toolbox, because we want that others are jumping on this. We also have a strong interest in improving in vitro systems. I will be very short here because on the food safety side, this is at the moment, I have to say, our work is of lesser relevance. We believe that some advances like stem cells, organotypic culture and high content analysis of these cell cultures are key, because 21st century science starts with 21st century cell culture and its quality assurance. And an important activity we are vested in at the moment is to develop a new version of good cell culture practice, which is addressing stem cells, organotypic cultures and these type of effects. This has been drafted after 2 workshops. It is short before now a version to be released to stakeholders for public digestion. Our own experience here in this context is about mini brains. We developed a model which we announced in 2016 at AAAS from induced pluripotent stem cells. Wonderful, highly standardized organoids which are spontaneously electrophysiologically active, have a lot of features which cannot be produced in 2D. I will not go into any level of detail, just saying there's an enormous number of projects at the moment with many different partners on both sides of the Atlantic, because this is an enabling technology to do a lot of things. In the context of food, I was invited by an ILSI workshop last year in Spain, where they were interested how to use this for the aging brain and how nutrition could possibly impact on this, whether these are types of tools to do something. Last point I would like to refer to, we are an academic institution. We have a lot of classes here. Some of them are listed here, more and more coming. We put these classes out for free on Coursera because we believe the next generation needs to be taught. So we released a year ago our Toxicology 21 scientific applications course, and the evidence-based toxicology followed in February. And as you can see here, this is from this week, we had already close to 3,000 people who were actively learning on Coursera. It's completely free. If you want a certificate for the course, it's $49, but everybody has access and can learn about these approaches. So I'd like to close this very short overview about what we are doing in this space with a quote by an economist, John Maynard Keynes, who said very wisely, "The difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones." And this is what our center is about. We are trying to communicate ideas, ours and other people's ideas, in order to promote the field. Thank you very much, and open for discussion. So, any questions for me directly? No, then we can move to a general question and answer part. This is the only thing which is between us and the reception, which I hope is being built up outside. I'm sorry for those who joined us via the web that you can neither take part in the question and answer part nor in the reception. I hope you still will stay with us. Because of these, please introduce yourself so that they understand who is talking. And I hope there's some questions, some stimulating comments now from your side. Perhaps, Bernhard, to get started. My experience in the Commission was that the evidence-based approaches were very difficult to sell. I recall that only 4 years ago I asked a prominent scientist at ECHA, and he had never heard about evidence-based approaches. Yeah? Is your experience that this is taking up? Are you leading the pack, or is this work taking place in isolation to promote these approaches?
No, I think we are in a good relationship, I would say, with our sister agencies. What Marta also introduced, we call them the One Health agencies in Europe, the Medicines Agency, the Environment Agency, the Center for Disease Control, then also the European Chemicals Agency and us. We maybe EFSA is the driving force, yes, that could be, but I think we are moving more and more into acknowledging that evidence-based decision-making is an evidence-based assessment is the future, is a necessity. We are driving it a bit further in EFSA, and we did not only make friends with that by publishing guidelines on how to address uncertainty in risk assessment and how to communicate uncertainty in risk assessment, a topic that is not so much welcomed, I think, because society expects certainty, risk managers expect certainty from science and not uncertainty, so we don't make the job of the risk managers easier by communicating uncertainty, but I think it's necessary scientifically because it's there, whether we talk about it or not, it's there, so we decided to do work on that. Altogether, I think we move into the right direction. It's acknowledged also by the risk managers, by our political masters in Brussels. We could be faster, and I think we should be faster, and I think the only magic keyword here, even if it's a no-brainer, is collaboration. And the strange thing for me is that everybody would agree. Obviously, we have to collaborate, but still it's not done enough. And there was an interesting publication here in the US from the National Academy of Science about agricultural research needs for 2030, and this was a lot about the microbiomes, so the human microbiome, the animal microbiome, the plant microbiome, the soil microbiome. It was about the genome and precision breeding, the new plant breeding technologies. It was about sensors, it was about IT, data, AI, everything we know. But then there was something very unexpected. It was about team science. So the National Academy of Science people said, we cannot continue by just digging deeper on ever smaller surfaces. We have to team up in a transdisciplinary way. Again, you would say it's a no-brainer, but it's not done. So I think there's also a learning, at least for us in Europe, I would say. We have this gene of collaboration, but most of the time it's not expressed.
Yeah, okay, please.
I think Bernhard is extremely important point. What?
Go close the mouth.
No, it's off. It's off.
Maybe.
But you can hear me anyway.
I give you this one.
Okay.
I think this works.
Well, this is a general problem over the past 15, 20 years. You know, in the international health, but also in Europe in general. I think, partnerships is very difficult to do because there's no money for it. So if you look at, it's not for nothing that the global goals have number 17 as one of the goals is partnerships. And to my knowledge, the only successful program so far has been UNAIDS. Because we had millions and millions of dollars and billions to actually do the program. So that in fact there was money for doing collaboration. And I think I've seen that in nutrition, I've seen that in food security. In fact, there is never, donors are not willing to spend money for coordination. So everything has to come for free. And it's just impossible. It's just impossible because everyone works very hard, as you know, so there's very limited time. So in UNAIDS, I had a budget of a couple of $1 million a year just to go to meetings, to organize things. On top of course, the budget I would get from World Food Program at that time. And I think it's something I know that the EU is not willing also to pay, but it's the same for to a certain extent, the US in general. But when it comes to HIV/AIDS, it's not for nothing that the UNAIDS program is funded bipartisan by the US. It started with Bush, and Obama continued with the money, and even now we still have money for the whole UNAIDS program. So it's something, partnerships should always be bipartisan and never only by one group. And it's something we really need to work on together.
I mean, many people don't know that there is actually a memorandum of understanding between the NIH and DG Research in the European side for medical research. There is funding by NIH for European groups, and American groups can take part in these projects as if they were European partners. We are benefiting from this already in a second project at the moment, and this is really an opportunity which is not typically used here on the US side, because the information is not out.
Yeah, I'd like to add here that's definitely the case, that there's no formal source of money for this, right? So it's only private foundations for the most part. So and also the travel budgets for many organizations is being cut, so it's not exactly inspiring or making it easy to collaborate. Also, there is no direct source of funding for cross-disciplinary research. Everybody is talking about how important it is, but there's no good sources of funding for this.
I mean, there's also cultural differences, yeah. I mean, for example, the overhead for every research project in Hopkins is 63%, and the EU is paying 25%. So it's very difficult to actually then participate with these different frameworks. Andre?
Yeah, I have a question for the director of EFSA. So, my question in the last years is a little bit that there are more and more interest groups from pushing into risk and hazard assessment, and not all of them are necessarily interested in making use of science or evidence-based approaches. They think they know the truth and just push in. You can also see that very much here in the United States. So I was wondering, there's this very interesting construct of working together with external experts, providing the secretariat the tools and so on and so on. Do you see this as a problematic development, that there are more, let's say, populist kind of people pushing into these areas, or are you doing something to prevent that, or do you say, oh, this is all fine because it reflects the entire society, so we also need to have them in the boat, even if they are not really constructive members, but it's an important part of the society to have them be part of it? Sorry, that's more a political question, not really a scientific question.
No, I think it's a very important question or observation. I would like to come back. What I tried also to, at least to touch during my presentation, is that we try to be very careful, not successful, but careful in separating the value-driven discussion about how the society thinks the future of the society should look like, which is not a scientific question. It's driven by values, taxation, environmental protection, inequalities, gender questions, to separate this from the scientific question on the one. So we want to protect science. We want to protect the scientific process, to have this process as value-free as possible. And I think scientists sometimes are a bit naive in saying, yeah, well, we are scientists, it's only evidence that counts, there's no value judgment. For risk assessment, it's not true. There are hidden value judgments also in the risk assessment, which is uncertainty factors, default values, inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria. This is not science, that's value judgments. So what we want to do is to protect the scientific endeavor to be as value-free as possible, however not to neglect the concerns of the society about the input, the question and the outcome, which is a bit of a paradoxon, meaning we should take care, and I use this really with an intent, to care about the concerns of society, contextualize why we work on a certain question, contextualize what does it mean what we have found, but not make our science a polyable science. I would call it the Facebook science. If we like, if 80% of the people like it, it's good science. That we cannot do, of course. And in between we have to be careful to protect the one, but to facilitate the other one via engagement procedures. But it's a tricky balance, because we cannot allow that natural science becomes a polyable science.
Thank you.
So would you say that the separation of risk assessment and risk management is a success model? Because I mean that's an obvious difference between the US and Europe. I mean you are acting only on the assessment side. You said others call it the framing of the risk assessment process, which is taking place from policymakers and others, yeah, which is setting limits. Is it better to be free and not interfere, or would you love to be at FDA and also take these decisions about regulation?
Well, we would love to have the budget of US FDA. Obviously, it's a different order of magnitude. I think the decision of the European legislators taken in 2002 to strictly separate risk assessment from risk management was a learning from the BSE crisis, from the mad cow disease, where one of our member states, it's not important which one, decided they could even leave in near future. There was a bit of you could say a trade overlay over science. So the things have happened that were not compatible with trustful or trustworthy science, and this led to a complete breakdown in trust into the food safety system in Europe. This was really a mega crisis. This is not comparable with BPA or with dioxins. It was a mega crisis in the European food trust system, and then the legislators said, no, we separate this. You EFSA only do risk assessment, and you should be as free as possible from any external pressure. And this is why we have an extremely complex process, how to make sure that our experts that we use don't have conflicts of interests. They shall have interests, because if they don't have interests, they are not interesting for us. But there should not be a conflict of interest. And this is a very tricky situation. If you see the situation of research in Europe, and I think it's even worse, I don't want to do a value judgment, it's even more in the US, that you have to have private funding for your research. You need public-private partnerships to get research money. So these people at the universities, obviously they work with industry money, but then when they come to our door, we say, what? Your research budget was funded by private industry? You have a conflict of interest. You don't work with us. And this is a big problem, because the question is, how independent can science be, or should science be, so that we can use it for very important risk questions of the society? And everybody says, yeah, we need more independent science. And I say, okay, but who is an independent scientist? Maybe Mr. Bill Gates could be an independent scientist. But are the university researchers independent scientists? I don't believe that. You have to run for money. So this paradoxon that our political masters ask for the most independent science, on the other hand, we want to have the most experienced, excellent scientists, is a paradoxon. It's a contradiction. And we have to maneuver through this. Coming back to your question now, I think the separation was a good one. Maybe sometimes it goes too far, because then if risk management, risk assessment don't talk to each other enough, it can also become complicated, because it could mean that we answer questions that are irrelevant for society. So this dialogue, which is foreseen in the risk analysis triangle between risk assessors, risk managers and the risk communication part, is very important. Still, I think that the model we have in Europe is very robust and leads to good science and leads to good protection of public health, which at the end is our objective.
I mean, you said something very interesting about size of FDA in comparison. If you see, FDA has 15,000 employees and many additional contractors. Yeah? Compare this to EMA and EFSA combined, it is 10 times more. Yeah? So this is really illustrating. But one of the big differences is also that FDA has an intramural research program. So they have the researchers inside. Would you feel that, because there's also this separation, the only research in the Commission takes place in the Joint Research Center, but not within the agencies. Would it be better to incorporate this and have your in-house qualified scientists?
Yeah, I think this is something we really miss. The research budgets that US EPA or US FDA and CDC have, it's hundreds of millions. And Marta was alluding to that, to do research that is directly influencing and supporting risk decisions. And we don't have that, because what we can put on the market for research funding is Mickey Mouse money. That doesn't count. So we have to rely on European research programs. The JRC does not do a lot of research anymore. Also, they change their nature quite consistently. They are becoming something like a policy knowledge hub, not so much in research, I would say. So that's something that is really missing in Europe. We have very slim agencies, I think very, very effective and efficient agencies, but this research part is missing. And we pay a price for that, because as Marta said, we have knowledge gaps and data gaps which we cannot fill with our own money. And that's something also now the policymakers in Europe have seen. So for example, for the new Horizon Europe program, it's about 105 billion euros, the program. It's a big program. They have earmarked 10 billion euros for agri-food research, which is good. No? So it's something that fulfills our needs, but it also comes with what you said, sustainability of the food system, food security issues, and the transformation of the food system, so that also in 2050 there will still be a planet. So that needs quite an investment.
Even if you only look at the Center for Food Safety and Advanced Nutrition, at our 2012 Food Safety Symposium we did with them, they said they had I think an $80 million budget per year for research. Yeah? So that's quite substantial. Yeah, this would be, and I think the proximity to science is so important. Yeah, not just administrating groups and paperwork. Yeah. Okay. We have time for at least one more question.
I would like to ask a question.
Please.
On the adverse outcome pathways and the mechanistic approach of toxicology, yesterday we also discussed this at the margins with the colleagues from FDA as a consequence of their PPA clarity study, where they invested an enormous amount of money. They told us that in total it was about $50 million. And they included not only their traditional agencies, but I think 12 universities that got material and did research on that. There are two aspects. One of it is that despite having invested 50 million euros, the situation is as unclear as it was before. That's a bad outcome, I would say, no? Because basically we all thought also in Europe this is the final golden BBA study. After that we will know. And the outcome is now, after the results have been published, the people say, yeah, well, but we don't trust. And this leads to my question, because there were many in vitro tests applied on many different aspects, and even if there was no effect in the animals, there were always in fact effects seen in vitro. And the FDA was thinking, how will we make sure that we can once link effects we see in vitro tests to outcomes in the animal? And if we don't see that, we will always have the situation that people say, yeah, okay, maybe you did not see the genotoxicity in the animal, but there was an effect, which means it's unsafe. What would you say to this dilemma, maybe?
I mean, every chemical is toxic if you only increase the dose sufficiently. Yeah? The problem is, or that's the only approach, is to agree on what are relevant mechanisms and to understand whether at relevant concentrations these are triggered or perturbed or not. Yeah? And the concept of adverse outcome pathways, as it is fostered by the OECD at the moment, I think is trying to really create a consensus first on what is relevant pathophysiology, and then you don't have to discuss each and every time again that this is a relevant mechanism. Because it has been peer-reviewed, it has been produced by a number of experts, and then you can simply say, yes, I can show this pathway is perturbed, for this reason it's relevant. Or you can say the other way around, none of the known pathways has been perturbed, so why should I now go into an animal which has different metabolism, different kinetics, and possibly completely different receptors? Yeah? So I believe very much in mechanistic toxicology as the way out, also because life sciences is producing so much information on mechanism, which we have to incorporate. But it takes perhaps more than a human brain to get this all together and analyzed, and then we come to the big data and AI, whatever. Katya.
Yeah, we're at the beginning of looking at this and evaluating it sort of side by side with animals, right? But you can probably find, like, you can increase the dose and find anything being toxic in an animal. You can probably find some mechanism perturbed by almost everything, right? So I share your concern that this is indeed is a problem. The way the AOPs are constructed, and OECD really with their stakeholders really were trying to be inclusive and transparent and whatnot, but essentially it's a crowdsourcing approach, which is not that much different from the good old boy network, right? So there are experts who agree on something and there's maybe consensus and whatnot, but at the same time we're all looking under the lamppost to a degree, and even people who were at the developed these AOPs, you know, they agree that they probably, there are things that we don't know there. So I think the solution to this is for this community to come to a realization that there may be some way to do systematic maps of such things, to start putting the weight on different key events and initiating events and whatnot, and say, okay, so this is a knowledge gap, we don't know anything about it. And about this particular key event, we have information. So there's a good solid key event.
And this will be exactly the discussion we have in Parma, 1st and 2nd of October. It's about AOP and evidence-based approaches, how to combine this. I could not imagine a better closure for our discussions.
I have one more thing. I want to give our guests the EBTC t-shirts.
Okay, we can take this into the social part. Yes. Okay. So we do the group picture, and we will have drinks and some refreshments here outside. I would like to say goodbye to our followers on the web. Thank you very much for joining us, at least electronically. You missed a lot by not being here in person, but I understand we could go worldwide by doing so. Thank you very much. Have a good, safe travel home. Bye-bye.